This presentation is about the role that inflation plays in establishing a connection between cyclical dynamics and long-run dynamics. We will introduce a tool that we'll call the Phillips Curve that helps us understand the connection between inflation and unemployment. The starting point is the ISLM model, where we've summarized an economy in two curves, one that represents the equilibrium in the money market, that we call the LM, and one that represents the equilibrium in the goods market, that we call the IS. The intersection of these two lines determine an equilibrium real interest rate and an equilibrium level of output or GDP. Now we're going to add a vertical line that represents the potential level of output. This potential level of output is going to be related to the long-run dynamics of the economy, and we can think about it as the long-run supply of the economy. We can think about it as the level of output that is consistent with full utilization of the capacity that is installed and full employment. Now, the way the model is going to work is the intersection of the ISLM lines represents the short-run equilibrium of the economy. The vertical line that we just drew represents the long-run equilibrium. And what we need to understand is how the economy goes from the short run to the long run equilibrium if the three lines do not intersect in the same place. For that, we need to understand inflation. Now let's think about a very simple example. Imagine the economy starts below potential output. It starts to the left of the vertical line. We're going to be referring to this position as a recession or a period of low growth. Now, as the economy is producing below capacity, we're going to argue that there's going to be downward pressure on prices or downward pressure on inflation. Now, this pressure on prices, as prices fall, we're going to see that money measured in real terms is going to increase. Now, real money was a concept that was behind the LM curve. And if real money is increasing because prices are falling, this will represent a shift to the right of the LM curve. Now, as the LM curve is shifting to the right, as you can see, the economy is moving closer to the long-run equilibrium. But as long as we're still away from the long-run equilibrium, this process will continue and we see the economy moving farther away to the right. Now, this will only end when the economy goes back to the long-run equilibrium, or in other words, when the three lines, the LM, the IS, and the vertical aggregate supply line intersect. Now, this very simple intuition that says when output is below potential, prices should fall, we can take it to the data. Let's think about what is it that we want to test. Well, we want to test if periods of slack, and by that we mean output being below potential, truly lead to low inflation, and then periods where we're going almost to the right of potential output or even to the right, when demand is pushing GDP above potential output, do we truly see inflation? Now, to take this to the data, we need to look at inflation, but we also need to look at a measure of slack. Now, a natural candidate is to think about labor markets and in particular the unemployment rate. The unemployment rate will capture how far the economy is for full employment, how far the economy is from potential. Now, to make this more concrete, let's think about looking at the data through the lens of two variables, inflation on the vertical axis and unemployment on the horizontal axis. We're going to be thinking about a level of unemployment that we will call the natural rate of unemployment, that will be represented here by a vertical line, and this level is the level which is consistent with potential output. Now, the economy can be in one of two areas in this chart. Either it's to the left of that vertical line, and then unemployment will be too low, and we'll be referring to this as an overheating economy where we expect prices and inflation to increase. Or we can be to the right of the vertical line, and then unemployment will be too high. We will talk about a recession, and we will talk about downward pressure on prices and inflation. Now, if this model is true in the data, what is it that we should observe? We should observe an inverse relationship between these two variables. Now, that inverse relationship is something that we're going to call the Phillips curve. So let's take this model to the data and ask the question, do unemployment and inflation correlate negatively in a way that they give support to this idea that there's a Phillips curve. Now we're going to look at a case that is the US economy in the 1960s. Now here we have the US economy going all the way from 1961 to 1969, and if one follows the years, we can see a very nice pattern that resembles very much the Phillips curve concept. Periods where unemployment was high, like in 1961, were periods where inflation was low. As the economy heats up and heads towards 1968-69, where unemployment became very low, inflation picked up. Now, this is a clear validation that then the Phillips curve exists, and we observe in reality a negative correlation between these two variables. Now, what happens if we add the decades that followed? The 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. Now, unfortunately, the picture is a lot less clear. Here we can see all the data going from 1961 to 2017. What we see very much is a cloud of data, and if we were to look for a correlation between these two variables, we would find something that is very close to zero. We see points sometimes moving in the right direction, establishing that negative correlation, but other times we see movements outwards that would suggest that during those periods there's a positive correlation between unemployment and inflation. Now, does it mean that the Phillips curve is not present in this data? Now, let me argue that that's not the case, and there's a way to rescue the idea of a Phillips curve. In particular, let's do the following. Let's take the unemployment-inflation relationship and ask ourselves, in a normal year, in a year where we do not expect to see strong cyclical conditions, where the economy is growing at a normal rate which is consistent with potential output, where do we expect a country to be in this slide? And we're going to refer to this point as the long-term anchor. Now, the moment we suggest that the economy is close to potential, we're going to be thinking about the concept of unemployment, which is the one we just mentioned, which is the natural rate of unemployment. Now, imagine just for the sake of this slide that the natural rate of unemployment is about 6%. Now, we expect the economy to be somewhere around that vertical line. But we also have a sense of a long-term anchor on the other axis, which is inflation. Because there is a central bank that typically has a target for inflation, and if they're doing a good job, we expect inflation to be around that level. Now, for the sake of simplicity, let's think about the inflation target of this particular central bank to be around 2%. Now, what this gives us is a point that says, under normal conditions, we would expect our economy to be somewhere around 2% inflation and 6% unemployment rate. Now, the idea of the Phillips curve is that if conditions are not normal, we'll be slightly away from this point. If we are in a recession, we're likely to move down and to the right. If we are in a boom, where growth is really strong, we're likely to move to the left and up. And that establishes a relationship that we have called the Phillips curve. Now, why is it that we did not observe this relationship in the data? Let's argue that this anchor has not been stable. It has been moving. And as the anchor moves, we're going to use the expression the Phillips curve was shifting. So summarizing our intuition, the Phillips curve is going to be anchored by two long-run parameters, the natural rate of unemployment and the inflation targeted by the central bank. If one of these changes, the curve will shift, the Phillips curve will shift. Now, we will observe a negative relationship between unemployment and inflation as long as those anchors are stable. But if one of these anchors is shifting, we're going to see correlation that might be positive or negative depending on the way in which the anchor shifts. Now, let's look at a particular example. Imagine a country where the central bank has a certain inflation target. There's a natural rate of unemployment that characterizes the labor market. And initially the economy is in a position, let's call it A, where inflation corresponds with the inflation target and the unemployment with the natural rate of unemployment. Now, imagine the central bank decides to do a process of what I'm going to call disinflation, where they're trying to reduce the rate of inflation in the economy in a permanent fashion. So let's think about it as a change in the inflation target, a reduction in the inflation target from a level that was high to a level that is low. Now, what is it that we expect the economy to do? In the short run, it's going to follow the Phillips curve. As the central bank increases interest rates, squeezes liquidity, the economy will go into a recession and prices will fall. Now, we should observe in the data a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment. But we know that's not the end point. We know that the A point has to be point B in the vertical line, because at some point, inflation will have to go to the new level, to the new inflation target, and unemployment will have to go back to a new equilibrium level. Now, the way this is going to happen is by a shift in the curve. As individuals get used to the new inflation rate, we're going to see the economy gravitating to the new inflation target and the natural rate of unemployment, and that is point B. Now, we expect the economy to move following that arrow. We're going to go first to the right and down, but then it's going to shift inwards to reach the long run equilibrium point. And once it reaches that point, the economy now is in a position that can be characterized by a new Phillips curve, a new short run Phillips curve, which is at a lower level than the one we started with. Now let's take this theory, this proposition, this hypothesis to the data by looking at a particular historical event also from the US economy. So going back to 1979, 1980, the US economy had an inflation rate that was clearly about 10%. The unemployment rate was somewhere around what we could consider the natural rate of unemployment at that point, which was about 6%. Now, at this point in time, a new central banker, a new chairman of the US Federal Reserve, Paul Volcker, decides to set an explicit goal to bring inflation to a lower level in a permanent fashion. So this is a very good example of a change in the inflation target, even if at this point the US Federal Reserve did not use the expression inflation target. Now, what is it that we expect to see? We expect the economy to go first into a recession, high unemployment, low inflation, and then the economy to shift inwards towards the new target. Now, that's what actually happened when we look at the data. From 1979 until 1983, the US economy moved along what I'm going to call the short-run Phillips curve. There was an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. But by 1983, the economy starts recovering, going back towards a normal level of unemployment. It doesn't just climb all the way back up to where it was in 1979, because it is at that point that expectations of inflation are shifting and the economy is going to drift inwards towards a new level of inflation, which is going to be around the level that the central bank has set. Unemployment returns to the natural rate of unemployment, the economy recovers, and now the economy is on a trajectory that can be characterized by a new Phillips curve, which is again at a lower level than the regional Phillips curve. So this is a historical example of how a disinflation can be thought of as a shift on the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve still remains a valid concept, but one needs to be careful that if the long-run anchors of the Phillips curve shift, we do not expect the economy to establish a negative relationship between inflation and unemployment.